Welcome to the Creative Penn podcast. I'm Joanna Penn, thriller author and creative entrepreneur, bringing you interviews, inspiration and information on writing, publishing options and marketing ideas for your book. You can find the episode show notes, your free author blueprint and lots more information at thecreativepenn.com, and that's Penn with a double N. And here's the show. Hello creatives, I'm Joanna Penn and this is episode number 571 of the podcast, and it is Sunday the 29th of August 2021 as I record this, and I can't believe it's September this week. Like, how fast has this year gone by? It's crazy. Anyway, in today's show, I'm talking to New Zealander Edwin McRae about narrative design in the gaming industry. And even if you're not into gaming, I'm personally not a gamer myself, it's fascinating to hear how storytelling works in a more interactive environment. And we also talk about how this will become more important as we move towards Web 3.0, the experience economy, and different ways of storytelling in the metaverse. And you can listen to recent episode 568 for more on that. So that's coming up in the interview section. In publishing and book marketing news and interesting things, Seth Godin had an interesting article on his blog this week titled "The Inevitable Decline of Fully Open Platforms." And he says, quote, "Too much curation stifles creativity, opposing viewpoints and useful conversation. But no curation inevitably turns a platform over to quacks, denialists, scammers and trolls. Over time, the value of a uniform, a brand or a platform is defined by the worst people who wear it or use it. Trust and attention are in a long dance, but only trust wins in the long run." And I read this article. It was actually about Substack and the fact that Substack has started to attract scammers. But the same could be said of Amazon or ACX or Facebook or any of these platforms that we use that is essentially free to use and therefore attracts people who don't use it in an ethical way. Now, we all benefit from open platforms. The indie movement benefits from open platforms. There are no gatekeepers as such. We can write and publish what we want. But that also allows for scammers, plagiarists, pirates, and let's face it, the tsunami of crap, which is what people have accused self-publishing of for maybe at least 12 years since I heard that phrase the first time, and it does keep coming back. Now, in the early days of indie, the phrase was the new gatekeepers are the readers, and reviews were what helped pick out people who were doing well, for example. But people buy reviews and they are notoriously difficult to police. So you know what I'm going to say, right? This is my hobby horse. As Seth says, only trust wins in the long run. And this is something that I try and focus on, and I think it's super important. Your readers need to trust you to deliver quality books. And once you earn that trust, they will buy from you regardless of the platform. And I think this is what's changed during the pandemic. And those of us who sell direct from our own websites and the people who've been doing special projects and selling on other platforms, essentially you can have your own platform, but if people trust you, they will buy from you. And if they don't, then they probably won't. And what is changing is the trust in some of the platforms, but trust in authors remains. Now, there are authors, I'm sure, that you buy the latest book from regardless, because you trust that author to deliver a good book. And for most of us, that's only a handful of people, but that's amazing. And those people have earned our trust over time. Yeah, so I think that is super important. Seth's idea that perhaps the inevitable decline of fully open platforms means that there will be more controls in place in the future. And I think that a lot of that will probably be determined by AI and algorithms and stuff. But we do know of some websites and platforms where there is trust or sort of rating given to an established author who delivers files in the right format and stuff like that. And that results in faster approval of new files, and you're less likely to be marked as a scammer, for example. whereas a new author might receive more vetting. And that is actually the kind of thing we want, but not too much. It's like you still have to allow for new voices, but equally we do want some control and trust. So for me, and as you know, I want everyone to be able to write the books they want and for readers to find books from lots of different people. But from our perspective, we need to focus on building trust with readers, as well as with the platforms and the vendors and with each other. And as ever, foster our direct relationships through email, through direct sales, so we won't be dependent on the platforms if and when they change the rules because of these various things. So, as ever, it's about, and this is where I think it is difficult if you're trying to protect your identity. I think that this sort of trust in being human is super important. You can easily prove that I'm a real person because of the amount I have on the internet. But if you're using a pen name, that can be quite difficult. So I absolutely acknowledge the challenges, but I think the trust that we develop with our readers is the most important thing. Also this week, a couple of articles about print publishing on the Alliance of Independent Authors blog, an opinion piece or interview with UK crime author Adam Croft about problems he's been having with Ingram Spark's distribution through Amazon, and delays on pre-orders, and why Adam has shifted to doing print runs through Clays here in the UK and then essentially distributing and bypassing Amazon and Ingram. He says sales are better because availability is better, and also that costs mean you don't have to do big print runs. Even with 50 books, he thinks it's still worth it. I'll link to the show notes, and I know some people have sent me this from Adam's Facebook group and things like this. So I have a couple of thoughts to add. The biggest indie authors have pursued this type of model of doing print runs. A.G. Riddle, Jerry Riddle, I remember him doing this years ago. He had a pitch, and presumably still is doing this. I remember pictures of his warehouses with stacks of books wrapped all in plastic that he was shipping around. And LJ Ross does it here in the UK. And of course, Adam is a very successful author, and he does say that his sales are well over 90% UK based. So if you have the time, energy and money to invest in setting up distribution in a primary market, and I think that's really important, 90% UK based means that Adam can focus on the UK. That's certainly not true of me. Most of my audience, for example, is the US. So completely different market. And this is a model that you really should only focus on in your primary market, I think. It's very difficult to do it everywhere. If you have the time, energy and money to invest in setting up the distribution, then yes, it can be worth it. But that is not the situation for most indie authors. It's certainly not for me. And I don't know if that's something I will ever want to do as a main business model. So the Alliance of Independent Authors has another article that goes alongside Adam's interview with the different points to consider. If you're hearing these things and thinking, well, I should just do that. Well, there's a few things to consider. One is, what is your business model as an author? If you want to focus on print distribution in specific territories, then of course you can do this type of model. And probably if you put in a lot of effort up front to get all the designs done and the costing and figure out the distribution, you'll have a process that will work in the future. You could have higher production quality. There are many possible positives of that model, as Adam discusses. But personally, you definitely need a business plan for this. You have to have sorted out your distribution. You need an audience. Absolutely. And you need a budget because, of course, you're going to pay up front. Now, I definitely got bitten by this when I started out. I remember putting several thousand books into a landfill because printing is easy. Like, printing books is easy. You get some design files, you give them to a printer and they print some books. It's the selling books, the distribution, these things are difficult. And that hasn't changed. Selling books remains as hard as ever. And Adam, for example, LJ Ross, Jerry Riddle, these are very successful fiction authors who are managing their print models around getting their books out and doing all the marketing and stuff like that. Plus, you also have to pay up front to print those books. So cash flow is very different. Remember, with print on demand, yes, you need the design and setup files, but you don't pay anything, essentially. It is free. And then the customer pays for the printing and you get the profit. And I love that model. Now, you can partner with companies for print-only deals. And again, some of the biggest indie authors have deals like that. Hugh Howey is quoted in that Alliance of Independent Authors article. Mark Dawson here in the UK has a print partnership with a publisher. There's lots of options. Personally, I am still more than happy with print on demand. I've never had any significant issues. Now, would I make more money if I did this kind of distribution thing? I don't know. I mean, it's possible, particularly for my nonfiction perhaps, but I really focus on global distribution with print on demand, and that's what I love doing. I also love no hassle. Print on demand is just no hassle. I just like getting paid. It is just me in this business now. It's just me running this. I like to have also a location independent business. So essentially you have to decide what you want. Now, I am intending to do a special print run, as I talked about with John Bond from White Fox on a recent show. When I do maybe the shadow book, certainly my memoir, my travel memoir, I'll do a special print run for those people who are interested in buying a special print edition. But I just don't think I could ever see myself doing what Adam's doing or LJ Ross. It's just a very, very different business model. So only you can decide what you want to do. And in fact, when you hear different opinions from different people, including myself, whatever I say, you need to take a step back and consider what applies to you. For example, a new author with no established brand, no audience, no money from sales of other books to spend on print runs. You'd be crazy if you tried to do a print run and instead of doing print on demand. I mean, that's the mistake I made and I wouldn't recommend it. But if you have the budget, a business plan for distribution, an audience, and email lists, the time to spend on setting it all up, then of course it's worth looking into. Remember, there is no one size fits all when it comes to indie. Indie authors are running different kinds of publishing businesses with different definitions of success. For example, again, that business model that Adam's got there is completely different to someone who writes a book a month and publishes ebooks within KU. That's a completely different business model again. So you have to choose what you want to do with your time and your definition of success and choose your own path. It is a choose your own adventure, the indie author way. And you have to you listen to all these different people, decide what you want for your life, and then follow that path or make your own path. That's what it's all about. So my personal update, I am still working towards the end of the first draft with Tomb of Relics. Now I know it is a novella, although it's actually going to be a long novella. It's going to be almost a novel, but just not quite. I mean, who knows? I'm still writing it. But I've also been recording a video as I write with Pseudowrite, how I use Pseudowrite, this AI tool I did an interview with Amit earlier this year. And also exploring how I write with the AI side of things, which will become part of my NFT package. More to come on that once I figure it all out. I feel like the time is ticking away this year and I've got so much more I need to do. I'm also working on Books and Travel personal episode about London, and also had even started writing bits and bobs for my pilgrimage book, which is hilarious. I just have way too many open books at the moment, open loops with all my books. Also went out this week is a discussion about Canterbury, which inspired Tomb of Relics, the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, over 850 years ago, whatever it is. Check out A History of England Written in Stone on my Books and Travel podcast, as mystery author Anna Sayburn-Lane and I discuss what we love about the cathedral and the area. Yeah, the murder of Becket inspired both of us, but it's interesting. I read Anna's book, and it's always difficult when you're writing a book with the same inspiration, but it's a classic example of different things inspiring different stories, because if you said, oh yes, well, both J.F. Penn and Anna Sayburn-Lane have written books inspired by Becket, as well as tons of other people, obviously, you would not think it, because I read Anna's book and mine is so completely different. It's that's why as authors we can pick the same, we can give the same writing prompt to 5 authors, 100 authors, and everyone will write something different. Such is the creative process. I also went to a practical workshop on Friday. I went to Bristol, which was exciting, and I made letterpress art, which is I'm thinking about in terms of my NFTs again, the sort of visual art side, and also in terms of my more personal books in the future, doing some, because letterpress printing is got a very different tactile feel to it. So, maybe I do a limited print run with a sort of ex libris letterpress print that I get commissioned, that type of thing. So I'm just really thinking about different beautiful physical print products that I want to do in my future. As digital becomes more ubiquitous and streaming and micropayments just grow, we need to build this limited edition side of things, beautiful physical objects and in-person experiences, this experience economy I talked about, which may be virtual reality, for example. And also the NFTs, the limited edition digital products, for example. So yeah, I was starting to organise an in-person workshop in New Zealand for, we're hopefully, fingers crossed, going for the southern summer, northern winter. Jonathan's mum is in Auckland, so we're going there. But New Zealand just went into lockdown, so I'm not quite sure how that will work out. We may leave here and go into lockdown in New Zealand, or we will see. I mean, the pandemic continues to disrupt our plans, and that's part of why all this digital and virtual stuff will continue to accelerate, because let's face it, we all thought 2021 it would all be over, but it's not. So yeah, you can see some of my letterpress art on Instagram at JFPennAuthor or on Facebook at JFPennAuthor. And I made 2 prints, a small print of "This Too Shall Pass," which is my pandemic mantra, and also my recovering from COVID mantra. Some days I still can't do anything at all. It's not long COVID. Someone asked me that. No, the normal COVID, or the mild COVID Delta variant, is about 3 months. It's 2 weeks of the hardcore and then about 3 months of recovery. So yeah, some days I can do anything, and then some days I can't. It really is. It's about that. I also made a poster of "Measure Your Life by What You Create," which I'm going to frame and put on my wall, which still drives me, to be honest. That's why I left my day job, because I was measuring, I couldn't measure anything I'd done in my life really just by time, but to measure my life by the things I create, the books, the podcast, for example. It drives me. So, and especially as every day at the moment, I have to choose what I have energy to actually do. And it's never social media. It's never email. It's books, writing books, reading books for my research and podcasting. That's what I pretty much choose to do. And yeah, it's a good thing to remember. So thanks for all your emails and tweets and comments this week. Stephen left a comment on the blog. "Your idea as a discovery writer is novel to me. I like it very much. Thank you for the interview with David Christinger. He came across very charming and personable. I liked his style of resolving writing issues, and I learned a lot from this interview." Thank you, Stephen. Donna Harper says that she agrees with the psychic weight loss idea of writing. She said, "Spot on. I find writing scenes for my memoir on my traumatic past is very cathartic, and I do feel lighter in spirit afterwards." And then thank you for some pictures. Ranjani Writer says, listening to the podcast from Singapore on a rainy afternoon. Oh, I'd love to go to Singapore right now, or anywhere. To be honest, I'd be happy just to go across the pond to France or something. Looking forward to travelling again. And also Dr. Jimmy Aaron Kepler said, listening while on holiday in Marfa, Texas, USA. I still write mornings at the local coffee shop named Frama at Tumbleweed Laundromat. That's brilliant. Thank you for those pictures. And in fact, those pictures from Jimmy were in the gorgeous letterpress, I think. So yeah, I find the sort of word art really fascinating. So you can tweet me at The Creative Penn. You can leave a comment on the show. You can always email me, joanna@thecreativepenn.com. Let me know what you think of the podcast and any comments. Oh, and send me pictures from where you are so we can all virtually travel. So today's show is sponsored by Reedsy, the marketplace for vetted professional freelancers who can help you with your indie author career. They have editors, cover designers, book designers, formatters, as well as people who can help with your website, your marketing and advertising, as well as translators if you're getting into that. I've used Reedsy to find experts to help with my advertising because that is my weak point. I still have a Reedsy expert doing my Amazon ads and have also used people to do Facebook ads for both fiction and non-fiction. If you want to use Reedsy, you outline your project, check out freelancers and receive quotes, then agree a timeline and a contract and start work. I particularly love that Reedsy vets the freelancers, so you can be confident in the quality of the work, but also payments and emails go through the Reedsy marketplace, so it's all transparent. So if you have a problem with a freelancer, they can help sort it out. They also have free courses that can help you with everything from craft to self-publishing to marketing, and they have free formatting tools, lists of book bloggers to get reviews and much more. Check it out through my link, thecreativepenn.com/Reedsy, REEDSY, thecreativepenn.com/Reedsy. This type of corporate sponsorship pays for the hosting, transcription and editing, but my time in creating the show is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And I did the Q&A recently. I can't remember, the time is just flying by. I think it was last week, and answered lots of quite personal things actually this week about mindset and validation and things like that. So if you support the show for even just $1 or £1 or a GBP or a pound, GBP, or a Canadian dollar a month or a euro, you will get the extra Q&A audio and all the backlist too. Thanks to new patrons Maggie Pope, Dan and Shannon Brown, and to everyone who's been supporting the show for months and years. You guys are amazing. You can support the show at patreon.com, patreon.com/thecreativepenn with a double N. Right, let's get into the interview. Edwin McRae is a freelance narrative designer for the games industry. He's also a game design teacher and writer of non-fiction for authors, including narrative design for writers. Welcome, Edwin.
Kia ora, Joanna, and tēnā koutou to your audience. It's really cool to be here.
You should probably just explain that.
Sorry, I just said basically hello and hello everyone in Māori.
It's because you're in New Zealand, right?
Exactly, because I'm in New Zealand.
Just so everybody knows.
It's quite nice. A lot of people here, we try to use te reo, which is te reo Māori, in everyday conversation as much as possible these days. So we're all gradually becoming bilingual.
Oh, well, there we go. Interesting. Tell us a bit more about how you got into writing and what your job actually is. Like, what is narrative design?
Well, I'll start with the second part of that question, like to sort of discuss where I've got to. So narrative design is effectively the design of story elements that then go into video games. I steer away from the kind of general term of writing for video games because too often within the industry, the games industry, writing kind of gets siloed into things like dialogue and flavor text and the sort of what would you call it, player facing material that you would see in a video game, whereas narrative design goes it's a lot more behind the scenes than that, creating the kind of story experience for a video game, which I'm happy to elaborate on more what a story experience for a video game is. But I got into it via I started out writing a novel, pitched that around, almost got picked up by HarperCollins at one point, but to no avail. And then shifted to doing theatre for a while, and then studied screenwriting for film. And then on that course, which is at Victoria University in Wellington, I managed to get a work placement on New Zealand's soap opera, Shortland Street. So I ended up as a storyliner and scriptwriter there for 4 years, which taught me a lot about, churning out a lot of story and the best practices for that kind of fast-paced storytelling. And then I guess I got to the end of my tenure with writing for soap opera. I wanted to do other things, and then started to hang out with game developers in Auckland at the time at a game developers meetup. Met the guys at Grinder Gear Games who make the game Path of Exile. They Facebook messaged me one day and said, "Hey, do you want to try writing some dialogue for us?" And then the rest is history, I guess.
No, it's so interesting. We'll get into the different, well, you've done lots of different types of writing, obviously. But I wonder if you would also maybe start by giving us more of an overview of the gaming industry, because I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions. I mean, I'm 46 and a lot of the gaming I know, I guess, would have been the really old games that were around like 20 years ago when I watched my brother play things. But gaming is such a huge industry now, compared to the author industry, but it's also part of entertainment. We're all part of that. So why is gaming so important in the entertainment industry? And give us a bit of an overview.
Well, it's certainly become a large industry. So it has eclipsed, cinema as an industry. So I think I was looking a few things up. I think cinema is around 110 billion, games around 150 billion, like as in worth as an industry internationally, which you compare that to books. I mean, publishing still sits around as over 200 billion, but of that, books I think are around the 120 billion mark. So I would see sort of games as a platform being as large as the books industry pretty much at the moment. So it's certainly a significant thing out there. And but interestingly, your average gamer I was looking at is apparently, I think, 34 years old, has children, and owns a house. So it's not the, I guess, teenage stereotype that often, I guess, is assumed with video gaming. And looking at various stats, it ranges, for instance, in Australia, 80% of gamers are over 18. In the US, 70% are over 18. So it's quite a mature audience, and perhaps more mature than people might assume.
And what about the gender split? Because there used to be this sort of thing that it was mostly guys, but from what I've read now, a lot of women are gaming, a lot of women getting into game design and things. And also there are educational games. It's not just shooting, is it?
Oh, absolutely. The curious thing with games, it's like almost like referring to a game is the same as referring to a book. As a book can be anything from a thriller to a dad's joke book. It could be horror to a kid's picture book. It's the same range with games. It can be everything from, yes, your Grand Theft Autos and your Call of Duty shooters, but right to, for instance, there's a company here in Dunedin, Runaway Play, that makes effectively nature simulation games and games about cat cafes and games about dog refuge centres. So there's a full range within the type of games that are out there. There's really something for everyone.
And then just before we get into some more question about the narrative, what kind of devices are we using now? Like there are obviously the high-end games where you need whole consoles and things, but then a lot of people, you see people playing games on their mobile phone.
Exactly. And actually, and I've realized I missed the gender question, is that especially with mobile phone, the gender split is 50-50 in many countries, in fact, in most countries. So, yeah, there is no kind of bias either way with gaming. And I think with mobile especially, the female audience is sort of significantly larger, sort of 60, almost to 70%.
I find it fascinating, and I definitely think things will change. As you mentioned there, people, the average in inverted commas being 34 with children in a house. We're talking about people with money now, and some of these games, I guess I would say they don't sound expensive. You might pay, what is it, like $70 or something for one of these really premium games, but then the amount of hours you can play that, it actually seems quite good value. So is that how these things, I mean, there's obviously the cheap ones on the mobile, isn't there, but the ones I hear people talk about are these sort of quite immersive ones.
Yeah, the other ones that get the most press is the really big ones, Cyberpunk 2077 or Witcher 3 or Skyrim, big sort of games that you can explore for up to 100 hours, 200 hours, 300 hours for some. But yeah, and those are your larger titles that cost between, say, 50 to 100, $120. But then you'll get, so especially in the indie game dev scene, you'll get games that are anywhere from $2 to $20. And even in those, you'll tend to have a good 10 to 20 hours of gameplay in those. And they, again, that can be on mobile, can be on PC, can be on console. So just as there's a range like in size, like was it Jordan's
Wheel of Time.
Wheel of Time, thank you. You know, there's that epic, massive series that you can explore. There are short stories and novellas in the game scene as well. So yeah, again, it's a full range of experience on offer.
That is a really great overview. And as you said, a full range of experience. And I think this experience idea and this idea of entertainment, I think sometimes we forget that as authors. We get into the book we're doing and we forget that out there, people want entertainment, education, inspiration, and sometimes it doesn't matter what medium they get it from. And so I often feel that it's like it's just a very different experience. So let's talk about writing then. So how does writing for these games differ from writing a linear book? And obviously we can't talk about every different type, but it feels like it's a very different thing writing for an experience than it is for a sort of linear book.
It absolutely is, because I've written novels myself, and the experience I'd liken it to is that it's almost like you're designing a sideshow ride. Like if you were going to do a horror-themed train ride for a sideshow, that would be closer to what, say, a narrative designer does. So you're not necessarily writing a plot for the people to sit in the train and experience. It's more like you're thinking about what is the overall emotion I want them to experience. And in that case, it might be fear, shock, things like that. And then it's thinking about how can I create a cohesive world that these people can ride through and get a sense that everything fits together on this horror train. All the pieces work together to create an overall experience. And in that, there are elements of story. There will be characters, there will be settings, there will be little bits of dialogue, there will be images and all sorts of elements that go into that. But the narrative designer's job is more of that thinking of how do all these different pieces fit together. And I guess I realized with the train example, that's still linear. So in many respects, that's still quite similar to, say, writing a novel. Like you're doing all of those things with writing a novel as well. You're thinking about setting, character, how you're going to describe the environment that the characters are moving through. How do you describe the action? All of those elements. But I guess the tricky thing is then when the train starts to branch off into 10 possibilities, when the players get to a junction and go, okay, I've got 10 options here, and somebody has to write each of those 10 options and what's going to happen in those options. I guess that's where it starts to get tricky and much more game-like.
Yeah, and that's what fascinates me, because I did the masterclass with James Patterson. Have you seen that?
I've heard of it.
Yeah, well, it's very, very good, because obviously James Patterson being one of the top sellers in the world, and whatever people think of his writing, the dude is obviously very successful. So I did his masterclass, and one of the things he talks about, so he's a plotter, and an outliner, and does a lot of co-writing. But what he does is every single thing he comes up with several different ways the character could go, and writes down those different things. So he'll be like, okay, like you say, call a junction point, that might be, does the character go this way and fight this person, or go this way after this particular thing? And so it's fascinating to me that kind of planning, because I don't do that. I'm a discovery writer, and in my head there is only one line. And I've heard Lee Child say this, actually. It's like, this is what happens. And if he's told to make changes to his book, he's like, no, that's what happens. There's only one way it happened, and that's the way. And it's so interesting to me because what you're talking about is this: you have to write the 10 different options, and then the character gets to choose which way to go. So I guess my question here for you would be, so how do we come up with 10 or even 3 different options for each of these decision points? Like, what are some of the tricks you use to come up with them?
Well, what I do tend to do, let's say, again, it depends on the sort of game you're working on. But let's say, so I worked on a game called Guardian Maya, which is a sort of dark fantasy interactive fiction game that you play on a mobile device with a wahine, a woman. She's a warrior, Māori warrior, and you help her basically go through the story. But there are a lot of choices in that you can make for Maya that will then alter the story. And so the trick is always working out scope, like scope being how big do you want the story to be and how much writing do you actually want to do? And how much writing can the production team afford to pay you to do? So at each decision point, what you do is you work out, okay, is this decision going to be a massive decision that's going to change the world? If so, then I need to think about how is it going to change the world, and then start to think about how much of that I'm going to show the player. But then you've got at the other end of the scale, if you want there to be decisions, but them not to be earth-shattering, to completely change the world and therefore require a lot more writing, you can start to play around with tweaks in behavior and tweaks in reactions from the world. So, for instance, in Guardian Maya, we had a thing called a mana counter. So mana being the Māori concept of, I guess, self-esteem plus the esteem gained from others, so respect. So if you chose to interact with the characters in the story in generally positive ways, you tended to build mana. And then what I would write in is reactions from the other characters based on what Maya's mana score was at that time. So if it was high, they would treat her quite respectfully. If it was low, they might treat her with suspicion. They might be wary of her. They might be a little bit sarcastic with her. And I could do that with single lines that would change depending on what that mana score was. And I did all of that in a tool called InkScript, which to me is my favorite narrative design tool because it still feels like writing when I'm making things like that. So yeah, so I guess that's one trick, is always thinking about how big an effect do I want this option to have, and then thinking about the scope of the story as a whole. Like, if I make this change, is it going to be massive? Is it going to require a lot of writing, or can I make small tweaks that still have the world reacting to the player, but not necessarily having to write millions and millions of options for them?
I know that is interesting, like a scale of how big the change is, because of course if you go this way and you kill off a character, that makes a big difference to the rest of things. And I've definitely written myself into issues where I'm like, yeah, this character dies now, and then I'm like, oh, now what do I do?
I've done exactly the same thing in my novels, because I'm also a discovery writer when I do novels, and I think it's because I like to take a holiday from all the heavy planning I have to do with narrative design. But what's also quite cool is when I'm being a discovery writer, I feel like I can put myself in the player's position, because again, as a narrative designer, you're thinking about what do you want the player to discover, and it's the discovery that's enjoyable for the player a lot of the time. Like, what's next? What am I going to experience next? So like one tip might be, say, if you're a novelist who wants to describe, actually what sprang to mind, I listened to your episode about pseudo-write and about describing a laboratory. So what you can do is as a novelist, you can write out, you can describe that whole laboratory. Now, when your character interacts with that laboratory, let's say there's a fight in there, and you need to know things like, well, what beaker is the hero going to smash over the villain's head, that kind of thing, or what elements of the room are you going to use, and you can just write that through. But if you basically describe the entire laboratory, what you're doing is you are then setting it up so a player can explore all the elements of that laboratory without you having to kind of guide them towards any sequence of how they do it or try and draw their attention to any parts. So it's that same sort of process when you go in and you've got a setting, you describe the whole thing. And then, of course, there's constraints when you're working with an art team or production budgets, like how much they can actually make. But as a principle, that's a good way to approach it. Describe the whole environment so that then the player has the option of discovering what they want to discover in that room, rather than specifically what you might want them to discover, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you have to when you're writing. I feel like when we write a book, we're often, a lot of the time we are just writing for us, but with a game, obviously it's a business from day one. It's a company that I know you have some independent game companies and things, but people are thinking of the gamer, the person who's experiencing the game from the beginning. So you almost have to keep that mindset. So it's interesting that you're a discovery writer with your own novels. So, but what else have you learned, or what tips do you have for authors that you've learned from gaming that you put into your novels?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I've been sort of mulling that over lately. It's if I actually bring up this kind of experience design principle again, and it's something that I would like to employ more when I'm actually writing a novel, and I'm going to on this next novel I'm just starting work on. We are, again, you're thinking about the player, or in this case, the reader, and you're plotting out not the actual plot, not the actual storyline, but what emotional experiences you want the reader to have as they consume your story. So it's almost, again, like thinking of them like a player, like what room, if they go into this room, what things do I want them to be able to interact with in their own time and enjoy and get a fright from, potentially, that kind of thing. The same thing when approaching a novel. If you are writing a scene, is thinking about what is the key emotion that you want to evoke with the scene. Is it anxiety? Is it excitement? Is it a sense of fun? Whatever the style of story you're writing, whatever it pertains to. It's thinking kind of like, experience first. What do you want the reader to emotionally experience from that scene? And then work up from that. As opposed to maybe the approach of what's next in the plot, like, well, what part of the story do I want to deliver?
No, I think that's really important. And this sort of idea of what you enjoy has to come into that too. So, for example, when you're talking about discovering what's in the lab, like for me, curiosity is a really big driver for why I read books and why I want to learn about things. So that's what I have in my books, is interesting settings and interesting things that are actually in the real world, because I enjoy those things and my readers do, and that's not for everyone. So you do have to find the things that you want to do and then go ahead that way, which I think many readers or many writers even might shy away from, because they're worried about what they like, or they think X will sell better. But what you're talking about there is, experience first, but it's definitely the experience for the reader and based on what you love, which I think's super important.
Exactly. I mean, especially as I reach for this next novel I'm going to delve into, which is a horror Western. The reason I'm writing it is because I can't find enough good horror Westerns out there to read. So I really am treating myself as the ideal reader. And so when I go into create a scene, I'll be looking at what emotion do I want to evoke in that scene that I would enjoy. Would I enjoy being frightened at this point? Would I enjoy being intrigued at that point? So again, it's a very different process for me when I am tackling my novels as opposed to when I'm working on games, because it is much more of it's a business. You have to always keep the audience in mind, because at the end of the day, that's the audience you're selling to. And if you've got your player profile right and you've tailored your game to that profile, then chances are it'll do well. If you not hit the player profile, then things get a little squiffier.
Yeah, and it's so funny that you're not writing like lit RPG, which to me would be obvious because you know this world so much. But clearly, you know the horror western. Like, as soon as you said that, in my mind, I thought about Westworld, which I know is sci-fi, but it's sci-fi horror western.
I love the first two seasons of Westworld. They're just amazing.
Yeah,
And
I only watched the first two as well. Yeah.
oh, good. Yeah, I wouldn't advise trying the third. Just
No,
quietly.
so there's definitely a niche there. But anyway, I did want to ask you, coming back on this software, ink script, and
Mm.
also the fact that you don't sound like you're a programmer. So if someone listening wants to get into writing for games, how would they go about that? And is this software ink script something that's important?
Yeah, well, I mean, Inkscript's a great place to start because it's open source for a start. So the company that created it, Inkle, they have been doing interactive fictions for a long time now. They do really sophisticated, fancy ones. 80 Days is it's a mobile game where is it Phineas Fogg and Pass for Two, and you basically have to get around the world in 80 days, but it's in a slightly alternative steampunky version of the world. And it's all done in text, interactive text, and InkScript is what runs underneath. So I would say as far as writing tools go, it's an accessible one because, like I said, it still feels like writing, especially if you're a discovery writer. I think that's important to still have that sense of, hey, as I'm creating this game, I'm still writing this game. There are other tools for those who are more of your planner type writer. Say Artisy Draft is a really good one, which allows you to plot everything out in a really visual style and also allows you to do all of your different branches about how the story might go this way if the player makes choice A, or this way if player makes choice B and C and so on. You can do it all visually in a nice big kind of map. And they also have cool tools in there, like you can even create literal maps of your world and then tie your story to the world so you can see how the player might be exploring the physical, like the landscape at the same time as they're exploring the story. It's got lots of cool features to it. But it really, again, depends what sort of writer you are and how you approach story. But as far as like the kind of the getting into the industry side, I think there are two very distinct roles. There's game writing, and then there's narrative design. So as I mentioned, the narrative design is more of the experience design, behind the scenes kind of stuff. Whereas game writing is the literal writing of dialogue, flavor text. So flavor text is the text that often comes on small items that you pick up in the game or other bits and pieces in the game, like if there's collectibles in the game, it might have little pieces of poetry on it and so on. There's barks, which is another thing. So there's all the sort of game development terminology, which takes a while to get your head around. But all the things that the characters will say as you're moving through the world. So, for instance, in Witcher 3, you are Geralt of Rivia and you ride your horse through all of these villages, and all the villagers have things to say to you. Those are called barks. So, and you can imagine that world is so big and so populated with NPCs, non-player characters. You can imagine how many lines of dialogue one would have to write in Bark. So there is a demand for writers to just get in and write a lot of stuff. So if you've got, especially if you've got a background in poetry or short story, and also, script writing, and I would say especially for theatre, because you already understand that close relationship between story and audience from theatre, then that's a good place to start, is freelancing, writing dialogue, flavor text, cutscenes, which are when the game stops and basically plays you a mini movie. That's often a good starting point for screenplay writers. In fact, for anybody from the movie industry wanting to come in, they'll often start writing cutscenes. So there are a lot of different elements to games that you can start on without any technical skill whatsoever. However, if you want a bit more control over your work and you want to be a bit more involved in the development process and kind of be the champion of story and the development of process, then it does pay to have some technical skills. And that's one of the reasons I learned InkScript, which does involve things like wrangling variables and states and kind of programming stuff. And I've also started learning how to use Unity 3D, which is a game engine and has a scripting language called C#. Although that's been quite a steep learning curve for me. But I think if you were to want to future-proof yourself in the games industry as a writer and narrative designer, I think having at least the willingness to learn the more technical tools would be really, really helpful.
It's interesting. This future proofing is something that I think about a lot, obviously, and I talk about on the show. And one of the things that I hear talked about a lot at the moment is the spatial web, which is this kind of future. Well, I say future, it looks like the first headsets. I mean, obviously at the moment there are gaming headsets, Oculus and stuff like that. But if Apple comes out with their VR, AR glasses or whatever they're going to come out with, we could see this sort of spatial web 3D world moving into more of the mainstream. And it feels like that suits gamers completely. And what I've heard people talk about in this new Web3 or whatever people are calling it is experience. And you said experience first, like you're designing experiences, and that's the way we need to think. So where do you see gaming going with the rise of essentially putting a screen on your face? And I mean, we had Pokemon Go a few years ago, but I'm certainly very interested in how these experiences could work. So where do you see this stuff going?
Well, it's interesting that the spatial web space, especially virtual reality and augmented reality, have been a lot slower to take the main stage of the games industry than a lot of people have thought. And it has been because the technology hasn't been ready. Like a lot of people steer away from VR because they get motion sick when they try and use it. I've not experienced that myself. I've actually found VR extremely immersive, but it's also interesting. As soon as you place someone in a virtual environment like that, the intensity levels, I think, go up. So it actually becomes hard work to be in there because your brain is just processing like crazy with this new world that you've just been dropped into. It means that I think play sessions for virtual reality tend to be a lot shorter because the player just gets tired more quickly, much more tiring than, say, reading a book or even playing a mobile game or even playing a console game. So it's been this kind of, what would I call it, the cognitive load on the player has been a real challenge with virtual reality. However, I think as I've just seen, for instance, Unreal Engine, I believe 6 has I don't know if they've released it or it's on its way. And I've seen, so Unreal is, I guess, the go-to engine for creating virtual reality. And it enables you to create super realistic environments relatively easy using a lot of AI rendering tech behind the scenes. And I think as virtual reality gets closer to reality, I think that will ease that cognitive load on the player and make it easier to actually be in that space. Because at the moment, literally, you are throwing a person into a completely alien environment. Even if it looks kind of like the real world, your brain is also processing the fact that it's not at the same time. So I think that's an interesting challenge for VR to overcome.
Obviously, a lot of that, just coming back on the motion sickness, I feel like that was some of the earlier iterations, whereas with some of the stuff they're doing now, that's kind of moved on. But it's also interesting, you mentioned Unreal Engine. I heard the CEO talk about that these aren't just virtual worlds for gaming, or that they might have started out as gaming, but like Roblox, for example, there are virtual concerts in these spaces, and these may be the type of spaces where we go to do our work, for example, or have these types of conversations, so that they're the worlds that were originally being built for, I say, just games in inverted commas, may also be platforms for other forms of, I guess, commerce and relaxation, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's an anecdote that just popped to mind about The company, so they were having staff meetings in one of the online games. It might have been World of Warcraft or one of those. So they were already starting to use virtual environments as conference rooms so that people could, dress up as their favorite avatar and hang out in a familiar, comfortable space to them and while they're working. So yeah, I think that side of things is also heading into some really interesting spaces. And particularly, I think the more that virtual technology can, I guess, create spaces that people can join together and inhabit together and they're comfortable, that again, it's future proofing against things like COVID, where if your office gets shut down because of a pandemic, then you've already got systems in place where you can hang out with people, communicate freely from the comfort of your own home. So I think there's a lot of potential in that space. The AR side of things is also interesting because again, I think it's been slow to take off because you've had this phone in your way. Like, so when even say games like Pokemon Go, you're going into an environment and you're using your phone to look through the phone to find the Pokemon, but you still have this barrier of a device and a screen in front of you. I think, yes, once the glasses wear becomes, I guess, a lot more comfortable, easy to use, and you can kind of ignore it, the better those experiences are going to become, so that reality truly does feel like it's augmented. You've got added bits that you want to be there, but you're not feeling like you're missing out on the world because you're holding up a screen still in front of your face. At least that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, me too. And I feel more attracted to the AR, the augmented reality side of things and we all wear glasses at different times, either for seeing or for, sunglasses or whatever. So I feel like that is going to be more natural. And also we look down at our phones too much. And if the screen is the world in front of you, then I think that's really interesting. But I guess for people listening, like neither of us are experts on all this and what, this is, but I don't think it's too futurist now. I think we're talking 3 to 5 years as opposed to 10 to 20 years. I mean, especially if Apple come out with a device like they did in 2007, the launch of the iPhone, within a couple of years, the whole mobile economy changed, new app store and all this kind of thing. So I guess my encouragement with this and talking about gaming is there's loads of different writing work and there's loads of different ways of telling stories. When you can license as well, I feel like there's a lot of licensing possibilities into gaming. So yeah, to me, this is a real positive move. It just brings more opportunity for writers because all these people want writers, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's the thing. There's a remarkable amount of writing that needs to be done still in so many of these games. And the larger the game, the more writing is required. So, and I think also the licensing is really interesting because if you look at, again, a very description-rich novel can be more easily translated into a virtual environment or an AR environment because all the elements are being described and the experience is being described. So it makes it easier for a development team to kind of take that and then turn it into a visual, interactable environment. So I think there's scope, for writers to have their work gamified, as it were, but there's also, these projects are so big and involve so many millions of words that, there's plenty of work going.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned AI rendering, which like Unreal Engine, and I feel like in gaming, AI voices have already happened. They don't necessarily have actors doing all the voices of the characters now. There are lots of different AI generated voices in gaming, so they're kind of ahead of that. But how else are you seeing AI being used now and moving forward? How much will you have to work with these tools? I don't believe they're going to replace humans, obviously, but I do think we all have to work with AI.
Absolutely. And I think, yes, in the games industry, we're working with AI all the time and have been for a while. For instance, if you look at, say, a fantasy game where you are exploring a fantasy world, and let's say you are involved in combat quite a bit, battling goblins and orcs and slaying dragons and that kind of classic fantasy stereotypical stuff. then those enemies have always had a certain level of AI behind them. Now, it could be really simple stuff, as in, for instance, it's relatively simple to go into Unity and then program what's called a patrol loop. So that would be giving, let's say you have a werewolf and you want them to patrol a certain part of the forest. You can set them going on that and they will do that. And then you can set some parameters to say, how far can the werewolf see? How far can the werewolf hear? How far can it smell? And as the player comes in, then you can trigger certain responses from the werewolf based on whether they've smelled them, heard them, or seen them. And that's gotten quite advanced. So in games like Dead Cells, for instance, where it's all centered around battling these massive, hideous creatures, the behaviors for those creatures respond to what you do. And if you can kind of think about that, like there's AI and all sorts of elements in games now that are reacting to the player's actions. So this stuff is already happening. For instance, like specifically to the, say, indie publishing scene, like what I've been playing around with is a website and system called Replica. I don't know, have you heard of that one, Joanna?
Yeah, I have, yeah. Is it, it's replica.ai, I think.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. And so I've had a play around with some of their voices, and some of them have just been fantastic. Their ability to render quite natural sounding speech very quickly, I think is a really interesting place. Like, I don't think it's going to replace voice actors anytime soon, but it's not a bad kind of second best as far as the enjoyability of listening. And it does require a different type of writing, though, because you almost have to iterate with the AI. So you'll write your paragraph, it will say it back to you, and it will invariably get some words wrong. And you almost have to start to alter your spelling and almost spell things wrong to get the AI voice to actually say it properly. I don't know if you've had that experience with some of your work with AI voice.
Yeah, and it's really funny because even AI itself, like the letter A followed by the letter I actually had to spell that out as like AY-EYE or something.
Yeah, so I almost want to ask, like, whoa, who's programming who here, robot?
Yeah, but this is exactly the point. Iterating with an AI tool, learning to work with AI tools. That's exactly what I think our future is. It's working with these tools to achieve more than we could do alone. And I think this is super exciting, but we could talk about this all day. I do have one more question for you before we go, which is, you have a family, you have a day job, you're a busy guy, and I have heard from many writers that they either have to give up gaming as enjoyment because it takes too much time, and also people who feel guilty about their gaming time, for example, if they have kids and they're like, worried about this, that and the other. So I wondered, how do you manage your time with gaming, given that it's your job and also fun and also presumably inspiration?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, one thing that happens whenever you make a job out of something, I guess the enjoyment can unfortunately come off the thing that you're working with every day. But so I guess my time, it's almost like the time I spend helping to make games has colonized some of my time that I used to spend playing games, and that's just an occupational hazard of working in the games industry. So I guess that would be one piece of advice I would have to writers looking at the games industry. So if you really, really, really love games, just beware that if you make it your job, you may not love games quite as much as you used to. But that said, I do still play games. With regards to with family, what I tend to do, especially my youngest is quite the gamer. I've spent many hours of Roblox time with her, especially online. And so we have tended to go on Roblox adventures together. So playing games with your kids is a great thing. And too, what I'll tend to do is if I am researching a game and it is, kid friendly. So this is my eldest is now 15, the middle one's 13, the youngest is 9. So depending on what game I'm playing, I may share that with them and we can, again, experience that game together and they can let me know what they think about it. And it's often really nice to get a totally different perspective. But 3 girls, they bring a very different perspective to the games that I'm playing that I might have. So it's definitely, it's a cool collaborative thing to do. And I guess the other thing too is I no longer tackle massive games that I know will take 100 hours to even just scratch the surface of. I actively look for games that are in the 2-hour to at most 20-hour mark. And even then, that's getting a bit much these days. But I guess then if I think about it, it's like, well, actually a 20-hour game, what's that? Is that even 2 seasons of Peaky Blinders? I don't think it is. So it's often not as much as you would think. So I would, I guess, hasten to assure people that gaming, can be a very managed and sustainable part of your life. I heard that Jane McGonigal, she does a lot of research into the positive effects of video games, and she said 23 hours per week is the cutoff point. Up until that point, and this was done with high school students, up until that point, gaming seemed to actually improve their performance at school. After 23 hours per week, then there was a definite drop-off. So it's all about healthy gaming. Just as you talk quite a bit about healthy writing, I would suggest healthy gaming. Be careful about the games you pick to play, and just manage your time that way, and play with others as much as possible.
Yeah. And I mean, really, it can be a lot more active than, say, watching just back-to-back TV, hours of box sets. And, Jane McGonigal is a great example. I'll definitely link to her. She's got a couple of books as well on gaming. And I think the other message is there's a lot more out there than you think, and there's educational stuff, and so that there's lots and lots of variability, as you mentioned at the beginning. So I think this is a very exciting space. So thank you so much. Where can people find you and your book and everything you do online?
Well, everything is on my website, which is www.edmcrae.com. That's EDMCRAE. And for tracking down my books, I publish wide. I followed your advice, Joanna, and myself, Rachel. She handles all the publishing side of our small press. So books are available pretty much everywhere. And specifically on the website is just the www.edmcrae.com/books. And that's where everything is.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Edwin. That was great.
Well, thanks. It's been awesome, Joanna. Thank you.
So I hope you found the interview with Edwin interesting, regardless of whether you are a gamer or not. As we move into what some people are calling the experience economy, there will be many more opportunities for writers and creators, which, as ever, I find very exciting. So next week, we are back into the author mindset as I talk to Becca Syme about questioning the premise and how we can consider our strengths as writers. I have found Becca's Quit books, which I've been reading, there's I think 5 of them, are really useful, and we have a pretty personal conversation that I think you'll enjoy listening into. So happy writing, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes and show notes available at thecreativepenn.com/podcast. You can also get your free author blueprint at thecreativepenn.com/blueprint. If you'd like to connect, you can tweet me at The Creative Penn or find me on Facebook at The Creative Penn. See you next time.